I first heard about the Red String Festival from an old co-worker, a travel writer who had a penchant for remote, nearly forgotten places tucked away in the corners of the world. His eyes lit up with an almost childlike enthusiasm as he scrolled through his phone, showing me pictures of a quaint village in the Japanese mountains. The images captured narrow streets flanked by ancient cherry trees, their gnarled branches heavy with delicate pink blossoms that seemed to glow in the fading light. Paper lanterns swayed gently in the evening breeze, casting warm pools of light on worn cobblestones below. The centerpiece of the festival, he explained, leaning forward with the air of someone sharing a precious secret, was the symbolic tying of red silk cords around the wrists of couples. It's supposed to bind them for eternity, he said, grinning. His enthusiasm was infectious, though something in his expression suggested he was holding something back. Romantic, right? But there's a twist. Locals say that if you break the string, something bad happens. Bad? Like what? I asked, half listening as I sorted through a pile of deadline assignments on my desk. The fluorescent lights of our office hummed overhead, making the images of that distant mountain village seem even more dreamlike and unreal. No idea, he shrugged, though a shadow passed across his face. But you know how these rural legends are. Probably just something to keep tourists from messing with their traditions. He quickly changed the subject, but I noticed how his hand unconsciously rubbed his left wrist as he spoke. At the time, I dismissed the story as just another quirky tradition, filing it away in the back of my mind, alongside countless other leads that never went anywhere. But when I found myself burned out from my reporting job a year later, drowning in an endless cycle of political scandals and corporate corruption stories, I remembered that conversation. The idea of disappearing into a picturesque village for a week was appealing, like stepping into one of those photographs that had seemed so impossibly serene. The promise of a cultural story was enough to pitch to my editor, who agreed that our readers could use something lighter for a change. 2 weeks later, I was on a train headed deep into the mountains of Nagano Prefecture, camera and notebook in tow, watching as the sprawling cityscape of Tokyo gradually gave way to dense forests and mist-shrouded peaks. The village, Shirogane, was even smaller than I'd imagined, nestled in a valley that seemed to exist in a fold of time, forgotten by the modern world. The air was different here, crisp and clean, carrying the sharp scent of pine and the sweet perfume of cherry blossoms. The roads were paved with uneven cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and the traditional wooden buildings leaned slightly toward each other, as if sharing ancient secrets. I arrived just before the festival, when preparations were in full swing. Red banners lined the narrow streets, their fabric rippling like waves of blood in the mountain breeze. Stalls were being erected by weathered hands that had performed these same motions for decades, and children darted through the village square, their laughter echoing off the old stones as they clutched paper kites and traditional sweets. It felt like stepping into another era, one where the boundary between the mundane and the mysterious was far more permeable. I checked into a modest guest house run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Tanaka, whose face was a map of fine wrinkles that deepened when she smiled. The building itself seemed to breathe with age, its wooden floors sighing beneath my feet as she led me to my room. She spoke in soft, measured tones that reminded me of temple bells, and smiled politely when I explained my reason for visiting. "Ah, the Red String Festival," she said, pouring me a cup of green tea with practiced grace. The ceramic cup was warm against my palms, its surface rough with age. "It is a special time for us." "What happens during the festival?" I asked, setting up my recorder on the low table between us. The late afternoon sun slanted through the paper screens, casting latticed shadows across the tatami mats. Mrs. Tanaka hesitated, her smile faltering slightly like a candle flame in a draft. Her hands, I noticed, trembled almost imperceptibly as she set down the teapot. The The red string ceremony is the highlight, she said carefully, each word chosen with deliberate precision. Couples tie the string as a sign of unity and devotion. It is a blessing from our ancestors. Her eyes darted to the small shrine in the corner of the room, where incense smoke curled like ghostly fingers. And what about breaking the string? Her expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over the mountains. Ah, that is something we do not speak of lightly. She lowered her voice to barely above a whisper, though we were alone in the room. The string is sacred. To sever it is to invite misfortune. Some say the Shinkan-ryu, the spirit of the betrayed bride, will seek you out. As she spoke these words, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, and the warm afternoon air grew suddenly cool. I pressed for more details, but Mrs. Tanaka simply shook her head and changed the subject, pouring me another cup of tea with slightly unsteady hands. The conversation turned to safer topics: the weather, the cherry blossoms, the local specialties I should try. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the atmosphere of the room, like a door had been opened to something that shouldn't have been disturbed. I chalked it up to superstition and decided to focus on the ceremony itself. I planned to interview locals, photograph the festivities, and write a charming human interest piece. Easy work. Or so I thought. The festival began the next evening, just as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting the valley in soft golden light that gradually deepened to purple like a fresh bruise. The entire village transformed before my eyes, shrugging off its daytime identity like an old skin. Lanterns hung from every doorway, their warm glow casting flickering shadows that danced and twisted on the cobblestones in ways that seemed almost purposeful. The air was thick with the aroma of grilled fish, sweet rice cakes, and cups of hot sake that sent spirals of steam into the cooling air. A troop of children performed traditional dances in the square, their feet moving in patterns passed down through generations, their laughter mingling with the thunderous rhythm of taiko drums that seemed to echo in my bones. In the middle of the square stood a wooden pavilion that looked ancient enough to have grown from the earth itself. It was adorned with crimson ribbons that writhed in the evening breeze like living things, their movement hypnotic in the lantern light. This was where the red string ceremony would take place. Couples of all ages lined up to participate, their faces glowing with anticipation and something else. Perhaps fear? Each pair approached to tie the silk cord around their wrists, reciting a short prayer under the guidance of an elderly priest whose eyes seemed to hold centuries of secrets. I took photos and notes, trying to capture the ethereal quality of the scene in words that felt inadequate. The festival's energy was intoxicating, drawing me in despite my professional detachment. Then, caught up in the moment's strange magic, I decided to participate. It seemed harmless enough, and I figured it would make for a more immersive story. Looking back now, I wonder if something else was guiding my decision, some force as subtle and inexorable as a silk thread being drawn tight. A young woman running a nearby food stall noticed my hesitation and approached me. The lantern light caught the planes of her face in a way that made her seem both young and ageless. "Are you visiting alone?" she asked, her voice kind but carrying an undertone I couldn't quite place. "Yes," I admitted, feeling slightly awkward amid the pairs of couples, like a single thread loose from a tapestry. She smiled, and in that expression I saw something that might have been pity. "I'll tie the string with you if you'd like. It's good luck to have someone join you." Her words carried a weight that seemed at odds with their simple meaning. Her name was Akiko, and she had an easy, friendly demeanor that put me at ease despite my lingering uncertainty. She guided me to the pavilion, where the elderly priest handed us a length of vibrant red silk. The material seemed to pulse with its own life in the flickering light, more like a vessel of liquid crimson than mere fabric. Together we tied it around our wrists, our fingers brushing as we formed the knots. She taught me the prayer, her voice barely above a whisper, "May this bond remain unbroken, now and forever." The words felt ancient on my tongue, heavy with meaning I couldn't fully grasp. The string was soft against my skin, its touch both comforting and somehow wrong, like a stranger's caress. I couldn't help but smile at the moment's apparent simplicity, at how easily I had been drawn into this tradition. But as we stepped away from the pavilion, a strange unease settled over me like evening mist. I couldn't quite place it, but something about the ceremony, or the village itself, felt off, as if I had inadvertently stepped through a door that was never meant to be opened. That night, I tossed and turned in my futon, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched by eyes that lurked just beyond the thin paper walls. The room was silent save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards, each sound magnified by my growing paranoia. Sometimes the creaks seemed to form patterns, like footsteps moving across the ceiling. I glanced at the window repeatedly, half expecting to see a shadow pass across the rice paper screens. But there was nothing except the occasional flutter of cherry blossoms in the moonlight. Finally, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a restless sleep that felt more like drowning than resting. My dreams were vivid and unsettling, painted in shades of crimson and black. I stood by a river of blood-red water, its surface rippling as though something massive moved beneath it, something that knew I was watching. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sweet decay of cherry blossoms. On the opposite bank stood a figure in a tattered wedding kimono, its white fabric stained with earth and water, her face obscured by a veil that moved against the wind. She raised her hand, pointing directly at me with fingers that seemed too long, too thin, and I woke with a start, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The next morning, I found faint scratches on my wrist, just below where the red string had been tied. They formed patterns that looked almost like writing in a language I couldn't read. The silk cord itself felt slightly looser, though I couldn't recall tugging at it in my sleep. When I looked closely at the string, I could have sworn I saw it pulse, like a vein carrying dark blood. I dismissed it as my imagination, a product of too much seiki and local legends, and resolved to focus on my work. As the festival continued, I interviewed villagers about the ceremony's origins. Most offered cheerful, rehearsed answers about unity and tradition, their words flowing like practiced lines in a play. But when I pressed them about the Shinken Ryu, their expressions grew wary, fear flickering behind their eyes like shadows behind paper screens. One elderly man cornered me in a quiet alley, his breath smelling of sake and fear. "The spirit only comes for those who break the string," he whispered, his rheumy eyes fixed on my wrist. "You haven't, have you?" "Of course not," I replied, laughing nervously, though the sound died in my throat when I saw how he flinched at my response. That evening, as I walked back to the guest house, I felt a chill despite the warm spring air. The shadows cast by the lanterns seemed longer, darker, as if something lurked just beyond their reach, waiting. The cheerful sounds of the festival felt distant, muffled, as though I was hearing them through water. I quickened my pace, clutching my camera tightly, its familiar weight offering little comfort. When I reached my room, I locked the door and slid the wooden bolt into place, though a voice in the back of my mind whispered that such precautions were useless against what hunted me. The next few days blurred together in a haze of festival activity and sleepless nights, like a fever dream I couldn't wake from. The dreams continued, each one more vivid and horrifying than the last. I saw glimpses of the veiled figure, her kimono soaked and torn, its white fabric stained with mud and darker things. Her hands clawed at the earth as though trying to escape a grave, leaving long furrows that filled with red water. Each morning, the scratches on my wrist grew deeper, forming patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The red string felt looser with each passing day, as though it was slowly unwinding itself, seeking freedom. On the festival's final night, I found Akiko at her stall, The lantern light cast strange shadows across her face as she smiled at me, but her expression faltered when she noticed my wrist, where the string hung loose like a dying thing. "You haven't untied it, have you?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry and something that might have been guilt. "No," I said, though it felt like a lie. The string had almost come undone on its own, as if invisible fingers had been working at the knots while I slept. "Be careful," she warned, reaching out to touch my arm but stopping just short, her hand hovering in the space between us. "The Shinkon Ryu is not just a story. She watches for those who disrespect the bond." As she spoke, the lantern flames seemed to dim, and I could have sworn I heard the distant sound of wedding bells. Her words sent a shiver down my spine that felt like cold fingers tracing my vertebrae. That night, I tried to tie the string tighter, my fingers fumbling with knots that seemed to resist my efforts. The silk cord slipped through my fingers like water, refusing to stay bound no matter how carefully I knotted it. Frustrated and frightened, I left it as it was and climbed into bed, hoping for a dreamless sleep that I knew wouldn't come. Instead, I woke to a sound, a faint tapping at the window, like bone against glass. My heart raced as I turned to look, the moonlight casting long shadows across my room. At first, I saw nothing but the swaying cherry branches outside, their movements too regular, too deliberate. But then slowly, a shadow moved into view. It was the figure from my dreams, her veil fluttering in a wind that didn't touch the trees, her rotted hands pressed against the glass. Through the thin fabric of her veil, I could see her face, or rather, the absence of one. I froze, unable to breathe, unable to look away. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, forming a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I scrambled for my camera, hoping to capture something, anything that could explain what I was seeing, that could prove I hadn't lost my mind. But when I turned back, the window was empty, though the glass remained clouded where her hands had touched it, frost-like patterns spreading across its surface. The next morning, I packed my bags with trembling hands, shoving clothes and equipment haphazardly into my suitcase. I told Mrs. Tanaka I needed to leave early, citing a work emergency. She didn't ask questions, but her eyes lingered on my wrist, where the red string hung loose, barely clinging to my skin like a dying snake. As I hurried past her, I noticed the shrine in the corner was covered with a white cloth, and the air smelled faintly of incense and earth. As I boarded the train, I glanced back at the village one last time. The morning mist clung to the streets like a bridal veil, and for a moment, I thought I saw Akiko standing by the road, her expression unreadable, her own red string conspicuously absent. Then the train pulled away, carrying me back to the safety of the city, though deep down I knew I wasn't really leaving anything behind. But the nightmares didn't stop. Even now, months later, I still see her in my dreams, standing by the river of blood, her veil soaked through with dark water that drips endlessly onto white silk. And sometimes, when I wake in the darkest part of night, I hear the faint sound of tapping, like rotted fingers against glass, and feel the phantom touch of silk around my wrist, pulling tighter, tighter, binding me to a promise I never truly understood. When Aya first saw the ad for the townhouse in Kyoto, she thought it was too good to be true. A traditional machiya home at an affordable price, within walking distance of the university. The listing stood out among the endless parade of sterile apartments and overpriced student housing, like a fragment of old Japan preserved in amber. The rent was suspiciously low for the Higashiyama district, where even tiny apartments commanded premium prices. But Aya was too enchanted by the possibilities to question her luck. She'd been searching for months for a quiet place to focus on her senior thesis, and the photos of the house, with its shoji paper walls and serene garden, seemed like the perfect escape from the chaos of campus life. The photos showed elegant wooden beams darkened with age, worn tatami mats that held centuries of footsteps, and delicate paper walls that filtered the sunlight into gentle patterns. But it was the small garden that captured her imagination, a pocket of tranquility enclosed by moss-covered stones, where a single maple tree stood like a silent guardian. As an architecture student specializing in traditional Japanese design, Aya couldn't have dreamed up a more perfect setting for her research. The landlord was an older man who met her at the gate on move-in day. His weathered face creased with an expression that seemed to hover between politeness and anxiety. He had a distant demeanor that made Aya feel as if he was looking through her rather than at her, explaining the house's quirks in clipped tones that betrayed an urgency to be elsewhere. The shoji walls were fragile, he warned, his fingers working nervously at the hem of his jacket. They needed careful handling, especially during the rainy season when the paper grew taut with moisture. The tatami mats required special care too. No shoes, no excessive moisture, no dragging of furniture across their delicate surfaces. She noticed how his eyes never quite settled on any one spot, constantly darting to the shadows at the corners of rooms, to the spaces behind sliding doors. He seemed eager to leave, practically thrusting the keys into her hands and hurrying off without the customary exchange of pleasantries that usually accompanied such transactions in Japan. Aya chalked it up to the reserved nature of elderly locals and didn't think much of it, though something about his manner left a slight unease that she couldn't quite shake. The first few days in the house were peaceful, almost magical. Aya spent her mornings in the garden, sketching the interplay of light and shadow as the sun filtered through the maple's leaves, now blazing with autumn colors. The tree's branches created intricate patterns on her drawing paper, like nature's own architectural blueprints. In the evenings, she worked on her thesis about the evolution of traditional Japanese architecture, surrounded by the very elements she was studying: the careful balance of wood and paper, the precise angles of the roof beams, the way each element served both practical and aesthetic purposes. The quiet was a welcome change from the constant noise of her old dormitory, where paper-thin walls had transmitted every conversation, every television show, every late-night party. Here, the silence felt like a physical presence, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant chime of temple bells. The house seemed to breathe around her, its wooden bones expanding and contracting with the changes in temperature and humidity. But by the end of the first week, the quality of the quiet began to change. What had felt peaceful now felt oppressive, like the stillness before a storm. The silence took on weight, pressing against her ears until she found herself straining to hear something, anything, to break its suffocating presence. It started with faint sounds at night, so subtle that Aya initially dismissed them as products of an old house settling into itself. The walls creaked softly in ways that seemed almost purposeful, and the wind whistled through the gaps in the wooden beams with a sound that sometimes resembled distant singing. But then came the whispers, emerging from the silence like threads being pulled from fabric. Low, indistinct murmurs that seemed to rise and fall just beyond the shoji walls, carrying conversations she could almost, but never quite, understand. She couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable. Angry, pleading, desperate. The voices seemed to argue in circles, their intensity waxing and waning like the phases of the moon. The whispers had a particular quality that set them apart from normal house sounds or street noise. They seemed to exist in a space between reality and imagination, like the lingering echo of a dream. Sometimes they would stop abruptly when Aya entered a room, only to resume from a different direction once she had settled down to work. She began to notice patterns. They were strongest near the garden-facing walls, and they intensified as the sun set, as if darkness gave them strength. One night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that the sounds were just her imagination, Aya swore she heard her name. It was faint, barely more than a breath, but distinct enough to send a chill racing down her spine like ice water. The voice had a feminine quality, but it was wrong somehow, too hollow, as if it was being spoken through water or from a great distance. She sat up, her heart pounding against her ribs, and looked around the room. Nothing seemed out of place. Just the faint outline of the garden visible through the shoji, the maple tree's branches swaying gently in a breeze she couldn't feel. Trying to shake off her unease, Aya decided she needed a distraction. She lit a candle, its warm glow creating a small circle of comfort in the darkness, and retrieved her sketchbook. The familiar weight of the drawing pencil in her hand was reassuring as she began to sketch, planning to work, until exhaustion overcame her racing thoughts. As her pencil moved across the paper, the faint whispers seemed to grow louder, more insistent, pressing against her ears like an unwelcome intruder. The voices took on a rhythmic quality that matched her heartbeat, rising and falling in an unsettling synchronization. She turned sharply toward the wall behind her, convinced she would see a shadow or some sign of the source. The movement caused the candle flame to flicker, sending shadows dancing across the shoji screens. Instead of shadows, she saw faint smudges on the paper walls, marks that she was certain hadn't been there before. Aya leaned closer, squinting in the wavering light. The marks were faint and uneven, as if someone had tried to trace a figure but stopped midway, leaving the image suspended between existence and absence. The smudges seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles, like a reflection in troubled water. She frowned, trying to rationalize what she was seeing. It must be dirt or wear from the house's age, she told herself, though she couldn't remember seeing the marks during her daily cleaning. She made a mental note to clean it more thoroughly in the morning and returned to her drawing, though her hand had lost its steady rhythm. By the following evening, the smudges had changed in ways that made her question her sanity. What had been faint, indecipherable marks now resembled the vague outline of a face, its features emerging from the paper, like a photograph, slowly developing in darkroom chemicals. The outlines were distorted, as if drawn by an unsteady hand or seen through rippling water. Aya felt a deep sense of wrongness as she stared at it, her architectural training making her particularly sensitive to the way the proportions violated natural form. The face seemed fundamentally wrong, its geometry impossible, its mouth stretched too wide, curving up at the corners in an unnatural smile. Its eyes were dark, uneven pools that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the fading daylight. She tried to laugh it off, though the sound caught in her throat like a trapped butterfly. She told herself it was just her imagination running wild, her mind playing tricks in the liminal space between wakefulness and exhaustion. After all, she'd been working long hours on her thesis, surviving on convenience store coffee and barely sleeping. The maple tree's shadows, the play of light through the paper walls, her own fatigue. Surely these could explain what she was seeing. Stress and sleep deprivation could make anyone's mind conjure phantoms from ordinary shadows. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of eyes following her movements from behind the paper barriers. That night, she replaced the paper on the shoji wall, her hands trembling slightly as she carefully smoothed the new sheet into place. The fresh paper was crisp and white, unmarked by time or mysterious forces. She took extra care tucking the edges tightly into the wooden frame, making sure there were no gaps or loose corners that might explain the strange markings. When she woke the next morning, watery sunlight filtering through the maple leaves, the face was back. Aya's heart thundered against her ribs as she stared at the wall, unable to look away. This time the marks were sharper, more defined, as if whatever force created them had grown stronger or more determined. The face seemed to be looking directly at her, its impossible eyes holding knowledge of things that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare. She reached out, her hand moving of its own accord, hesitating before her fingers brushed the paper. The moment her hand made contact, the whispers began again, louder than ever, a chorus of voices speaking in urgent, overlapping tones. Aya yanked her hand back as if burned and stumbled out of the room, nearly tripping over her own feet in her haste to escape. She spent the rest of the day at a nearby cafe, trying to convince herself that she was imagining things, that there was a rational explanation for everything she'd experienced. The familiar sounds of coffee grinders and customer conversations helped ground her in reality. The rational part of her brain, the part trained in architectural principles and structural analysis, insisted there must be an explanation. Maybe moisture seeping through the walls, or a prank by the landlord's family, or some peculiar interaction between the old wood and paper that created these effects. She resolved to confront him the next day, to demand answers about the house's history. The landlord's reaction was not what she expected, and it shattered any hope of a rational explanation. When Aya showed him photos of the marks on her phone, his expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over distant mountains. He refused to look directly at the images, his hands trembling visibly as he handed her back the phone as if it might bite him. "You should leave the house," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What? Why?" Aya demanded, frustrated by his evasiveness. "What's wrong with the house?" "That place..." He paused, swallowing hard. "It is not meant for living." His eyes darted around nervously, as if afraid of being overheard. Aya pressed him for answers, but he only shook his head, muttering something about what's already there and how some spaces remember too much. Frustrated and increasingly unnerved by his reaction, Aya returned to the townhouse, her determination to uncover the truth warring with her growing sense of dread. That night, Aya armed herself with a flashlight and resolved to investigate every inch of the house, to find some evidence that would either confirm her fears or put them to rest. The setting sun painted the rooms in shades of amber and shadow as she began her search, starting in the attic. The narrow space smelled of dust and aged wood, but held nothing more sinister than cobwebs and forgotten boxes. Next, she checked the storage room, methodically sifting through old boxes filled with faded photographs and yellowed letters, their contents telling fragments of stories she couldn't quite piece together. Most of the items seemed ordinary enough. Family photographs, old receipts, forgotten trinkets, though she noticed a recurring symbol that appeared on several objects, a circle with jagged lines radiating from its center, like a child's drawing of the sun, but somehow menacing. She couldn't place its meaning, but felt a strange unease whenever she looked at it, as if the symbol itself was watching her. Some of the older photographs showed families standing in front of the house, their faces blurred or obscured, as if they'd moved at the moment the picture was taken, or as if something had deliberately erased their features. As she moved through the house, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing through the wooden beams and paper walls like water flowing through hidden channels. Her flashlight began to flicker as she entered the final room, the one closest to the garden where the maple tree's branches scratched against the outer walls like fingernails on paper. She hesitated before sliding the shoji door open, the sound of wood against wood, unnaturally loud in the growing darkness. The room was empty, save for a small square hole in the far corner of the floor, its edges worn smooth by time or use. The opening was just large enough for someone to squeeze through, though looking at it gave Aya the unsettling impression of a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She shone her flashlight into the darkness below, its beam cutting through layers of shadow to reveal a narrow crawl space lined with wooden beams blackened with age. The whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices speaking in urgent, overlapping tones that made her head spin. Heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, Aya knelt to peer inside, her body moving almost against her will. Her flashlight beam caught something glinting in the darkness, a mirror, ancient and spotted with age, propped against one of the beams at an angle that seemed deliberately placed. As she leaned closer, her reflection began to shift, like ripples spreading across a still pond. Her face in the mirror was not her own, or rather, it was her face transformed by something that lived in the spaces between reality and nightmare. It was distorted, features twisted into impossible angles, its mouth stretching into a silent scream that seemed to echo in the confined space. Aya scrambled back, knocking over the flashlight in her panic. In the sudden darkness, she felt the air grow heavy and thick, like trying to breathe underwater. The whispers transformed into guttural moans that seemed to vibrate in her bones. She grabbed the flashlight with trembling hands and bolted from the room, slamming the shoji door shut behind her with enough force to tear the paper. She didn't stop running until she reached the street, where the normal sounds of traffic and distant conversations helped anchor her in reality. The next day, Aya packed her belongings with shaking hands, stuffing clothes and books into bags without bothering to fold them. She didn't care about the lease or her thesis anymore. All she wanted was to leave the house and never return, to put as much distance as possible between herself and whatever lived behind those paper walls. As she loaded her suitcase into a waiting taxi, she glanced back at the townhouse one last time, drawn by some force she couldn't resist. The shoji walls were empty, their paper pristine and undisturbed, as if the past weeks had been nothing more than a nightmare. For a moment, Aya wondered if she'd imagined everything, if stress and isolation had played tricks with her mind. But then, in the corner of the garden, she saw a shadow move beneath the maple tree. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill racing down her spine. A figure in traditional dress, its face a blank expanse of white, its hands reaching toward the house with fingers that seemed too long, too thin to be human. As the taxi pulled away, Aya vowed never to set foot in that house again, to leave behind the mystery of what lived within its walls. But even now, weeks later, in her new apartment with its modern concrete walls, she sometimes hears whispers when she's alone at night. They come soft and indistinct, as if they're coming from just behind the wall, carrying fragments of conversations she can almost, but never quite, understand. And sometimes, when she closes her eyes, she sees that face emerging from the darkness, its features slowly taking shape like ink bleeding through paper, waiting to be seen. When Sakura returned to her grandmother's village, it was as if she had stepped into a preserved fragment of the past, one that had somehow resisted the relentless march of time. Nestled in a remote valley where mountains cast long shadows across ancient rice fields, the village of Hoshikawa was small and quiet, its streets lined with wooden houses that bore the weathered dignity of centuries. The stone paths, worn smooth by countless footsteps, wound between gardens, where chrysanthemums nodded in the breeze, and elderly residents tended to vegetables with practiced care. Most of the villagers were elderly now, their movements slow and deliberate, their faces carved with the stories of decades spent in this forgotten corner of Japan. They went about their daily routines with the measured patience of those who had long ago learned that time moved differently here, flowing like honey rather than water. Sakura, a schoolteacher on summer break from her position in Tokyo, had come to care for her ailing grandmother, whose arthritis had worsened with the recent rains. It seemed like a simple enough task: help her with meals, keep the house clean, and provide company during the long summer evenings. But almost immediately, she felt an undercurrent of unease she couldn't explain, like a cold current beneath still waters. The house itself seemed to hold secrets. Built in the traditional style, with dark wooden beams and rice paper screens, it creaked and whispered with every shift of the wind. The tatami mats released the musty scent of age with each step, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper than they should be. Family photographs hung in the hallway, their faces growing progressively more faded as they aged, as if the subjects were slowly disappearing into the yellowed paper. It started with her grandmother's cryptic warnings, delivered in moments when the old woman's eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the room's walls. "Don't let the children follow you," she whispered one evening, as Sakura helped her to bed, her papery hands trembling as she clutched her granddaughter's sleeve. The summer crickets had fallen silent outside, leaving an unnatural quiet that made her grandmother's words hang heavy in the air. "What children?" Sakura asked, smiling gently as she adjusted the old woman's pillows. The cotton felt damp beneath her fingers, despite the dry evening air. Her grandmother's grip on her arm tightened, fingers like bird bones pressing into her flesh. "The children at the shrine," her grandmother insisted, her voice taking on an urgent edge that Sakura had never heard before. "Don't let them follow you. Once they mark you as theirs." She trailed off, her eyes growing distant, focused on some memory she seemed unwilling to share. Her grandmother's face was pale in the dying light, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed too raw, too immediate to be dismissed as mere confusion. The deep wrinkles around her mouth trembled with unspoken words. Sakura chalked it up to old age and the disorientation that sometimes came with the evening hours. After all, there were no children in Hoshikawa. The only young faces belonged to the occasional visiting family, and even those were rare, appearing like migrating birds before disappearing back to the modern world beyond the valley's rim. But the warning lingered in her mind, taking root like a seed in fertile soil. Hoshikawa's shrine stood at the edge of the village, where the carefully maintained stone path dissolved into a dense forest of cedar and pine. The trees there grew unusually close together, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy that seemed to swallow the light. The shrine had been abandoned for decades, its torii gate warped by countless seasons of rain and snow, its wooden beams gray with rot and spotted with pale fungi that gleamed faintly in the darkness. The villagers avoided it with a deliberateness that spoke of deep-seated fear rather than mere superstition, muttering about what happened as if it were an open secret that had festered in their collective memory. When Sakura asked about it, they deflected with vague warnings, their eyes sliding away from her face. Best to leave it alone, or that place brings bad luck. Some would make subtle warding gestures when they thought she wasn't looking, their fingers tracing ancient patterns in the air. Her curiosity piqued by these reactions, Sakura decided to visit the shrine one evening, despite the weight of unspoken taboo that seemed to hang over the decision. The sun was setting as she walked the overgrown path, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink that seemed too vibrant, too intense, as if nature itself was putting on a final desperate show before darkness fell. She had always loved dusk. It was a time of quiet beauty, when the world seemed to hold its breath, and the boundary between day and night grew thin and permeable. The shrine was smaller than she had imagined, tucked away behind a cluster of trees, whose trunks were stained black with age and moisture. Its roof sagged like the spine of a dying animal, and weeds grew between the cracks in the stone steps, their leaves an unnaturally deep shade of green. The air around the shrine was still, unnaturally so, as if sound itself was afraid to intrude upon its domain. She climbed the steps cautiously, brushing away spiderwebs that clung to her skin with unusual tenacity. At the top, she found a small wooden altar, its surface worn and weathered, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The offering box was sealed shut with rust and decay, and the bell rope hung in frayed strands, like abandoned spider silk. As she turned to leave, she heard laughter. It was faint at first, carried on a wind that shouldn't have existed in the still air, but unmistakable. The high-pitched giggles of children, playful, yet somehow wrong, like the sound of breaking glass wrapped in silk. Sakura froze, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scanned the forest, expecting to see someone, anyone, but there was nothing. Just the trees swaying gently in a breeze she couldn't feel, their shadows stretching and contracting in ways that defied the dying light. When she returned to the house, her grandmother was waiting for her at the door, her small figure silhouetted against the warm light from within. The old woman's face was drawn with an ancient fear that made her look like a carved wooden mask. "You went to the shrine," she said, her voice trembling with certainty. "They know you now. They always know." That night, Sakura had trouble sleeping, the darkness pressing against her eyes like a physical presence. The house creaked and groaned, as if adjusting to her presence, or perhaps responding to something else that moved through its halls. The shadows in the corners seemed to pulse with each beat of her heart. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, counting the wooden beams until they began to blur together, when she heard it again. Laughter. This time, it was closer, just outside the window, clear and sharp as breaking icicles. Slowly she sat up and peered through the curtain, the fabric feeling unusually cold beneath her fingers. The garden was empty, illuminated by the pale light of a moon that seemed too large, too close. The stone lantern by the pond cast double shadows, one darker than the other. But then, at the edge of the trees where the garden dissolved into wilderness, she saw them. 3 small figures, barely more than silhouettes, standing perfectly still, like pieces of the night that had decided to take form. They were too far away to make out details, but their presence sent a chill down her spine that settled in her bones like winter frost. Sakura shut the curtain with trembling hands and climbed back into bed, pulling the covers over her head like a child hiding from monsters. The laughter faded, but she didn't sleep. She couldn't. The darkness behind her eyelids seemed to move and shift, and every time she started to drift off, she heard the whisper of small feet on wooden floors, always just outside her door. Over the next few days, Sakura's unease grew like a shadow at sunset. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if countless eyes followed her every movement from just beyond the edge of sight. When she walked through the village, she saw flashes of movement out of the corner of her eye. Small figures darting between houses, gone when she turned to look. When she worked in the grandmother's garden, she heard whispers carried on the wind, words in a language that seemed to predate human speech. And always, at dusk, the laughter returned, echoing through the valley like bells underwater. Desperate for answers, she visited the village elder, a man named Mr. Yoshida, whose knowledge of local history was as deep as the valleys themselves. He was sitting on the porch of his traditional home, smoking a pipe that filled the air with sweet, fragrant smoke when she arrived. His eyes, sharp despite his age, seemed to see right through her. "The shrine," he said, when she asked about it, tapping his pipe against the wooden railing. Gray ash fell like snow. "You shouldn't have gone there. Some places are abandoned for a reason." "Why? What's so dangerous about it?" Sakura pressed, noting how his hands trembled slightly at the mention of the shrine. Mr. Yoshida sighed, his expression heavy with the weight of untold stories. The smoke from his pipe seemed to hang unnaturally still in the air. The shrine was once a place of worship for a forgotten deity, one whose name has been deliberately erased from our records. But after the shrine maiden disappeared, a young woman about your age, strange things began to happen. Children vanished from their beds, leaving behind rooms that grew cold, no matter how bright the sun. Those who went looking for them never returned, though sometimes we would hear their voices on the wind, calling for help that never came. The villagers began to see things, shadows that moved against the light, figures that didn't belong in our world. So we abandoned the shrine. We left it to the forest and whatever lives there now. Some things are better left forgotten. "The children I've seen," Sakura hesitated, the words sticking in her throat like honey. "Are they the ones who vanished?" The elder nodded gravely, his eyes reflecting something older than fear. "They're the dusk children. They appear to those who have been marked. They'll try to lure you back to the shrine, back to whatever took them. And if they succeed..." He drew on his pipe, the ember glowing like a dying star. "You won't return. Not as yourself anyway. That evening, Sakura locked all the doors and windows, checking each twice as the sun began its descent. She drew protective symbols her grandmother had taught her on each threshold, though her hands shook as she made the marks. She sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea, trying to calm her nerves as shadows lengthened across the floor like grasping fingers. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in colors that seemed to bleed, she heard the laughter again. This time it was louder, more insistent, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It echoed through the house, bouncing off walls and through hallways, a chorus of young voices that held no joy despite their apparent mirth. Sakura clenched her fists, her nails leaving crescents in her palms, refusing to give in to the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She closed her eyes and began to recite a prayer her grandmother had taught her as a child, the words falling from her lips like stones into still water. The laughter stopped. When she opened her eyes, the room was dark. The fire had gone out, though she hadn't felt it die, and the air was cold enough to make her breath visible. Slowly, she stood and made her way to the window, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't resist. Peering outside, she saw the children again. They were closer this time, standing just beyond the garden gate, their small forms barely visible in the gathering dark. Their faces were pale as moon-bleached bone, their eyes dark and hollow like wells that led to somewhere else. One of them raised a hand and waved, the gesture both friendly and horrifically wrong, like a puppet being moved by invisible strings. Sakura stepped back, her breath quickening, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. The whispers began again, low and urgent, a chorus of young voices speaking words that seemed to bypass her ears and echo directly in her mind. They urged her to come outside, to join them in their eternal games, to become part of something older than memory. "Leave me alone," she whispered, her voice shaking like autumn leaves. "I won't go with you." The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, filling her head with promises and threats in equal measure. Then, suddenly, they stopped. The children were gone, leaving behind only the impression of their presence, like footprints in fresh snow. The next morning, Sakura decided she couldn't stay in Hoshikawa any longer. The weight of ancient secrets and unspoken horrors pressed down on her like a physical thing, threatening to crush her beneath their mass. She packed her belongings with trembling hands and arranged for a friend to pick her up, though the phone call was plagued by static and whispers. But as she waited by the gate, her suitcase clutched like a shield. She felt a nagging sense of dread crawl up her spine. She glanced back at the house one last time and froze, her breath catching in her throat. The children were standing on the porch, watching her with their hollow eyes. Their expressions were blank, yet somehow hungry, their pale faces identical masks of ancient yearning. They stood perfectly still, like photographs of something that should not exist, their presence a tear in the fabric of reality. Sakura turned and ran down the path, not stopping until she reached the main road, her lungs burning and her legs weak with terror. She never returned to Hoshikawa. She arranged for her grandmother to move to a care facility in the city, though the old woman never spoke again, her eyes always fixed on something no one else could see. Even now, back in the relative safety of her Tokyo apartment, Sakura sometimes hears laughter at dusk when the sun paints the sky in colors that remind her of that forgotten shrine. And when she looks out her window, past the neon signs and streetlights of the modern world, she swears she can see small shadows standing just beyond the circle of artificial light, waiting with the patience of centuries for her to come outside and join their eternal play. Some nights, she dreams of the shrine, of games that never end, and laughter that echoes through endless twilight. And sometimes, in the moment between sleeping and waking, she finds herself wondering if perhaps she should have followed them after all, should have answered their calls and joined their timeless dance in the shadows of that ancient place. But then she remembers her grandmother's warning, closes her curtains, and prays for the sun to rise quickly. For in Hoshikawa, the children are always waiting, and dusk comes a little earlier each day.